Hey folks, welcome back to Ken Michaels Radio, where we talk all the time about the Beatles. And we have lots of great guests that we welcome here to the channel. And one such guest was on here not that long ago. He was also a guest on one of my podcast shows, Talk More Talk, a solo Beatles videocast. It's KRIS Engelhardt. And Chris is a real specialist when it comes to what I like to call Beatles side projects. That's when the Beatles have helped out other artists in some kind of capacity, either as a musician, a producer, or even as a songwriter. And he's put out a series of books through the years. His most recent one really is an up-to-date version of all of his information called The Beatles Fully Uncovered. And we're going to talk about a few of the Beatles side projects again here on my channel. So welcome back, Chris.
Thank you so much for having me on your show. I really enjoy our chats together.
Hmm. And like I said in our previous show, my interest in this really started with that book altogether now, which was my first glimpse into this other world of what the Beatles did for other artists. I already knew about Billy J. Kramer and Peter and Gordon and Cilla Black and those artists, but your books go really into detail about a lot of artists that fans know of as being friends of the Beatles, but a lot of artists that the Beatles had no prior contact with
Right.
until they worked with them, which makes it even more fascinating. So, before I start, I just wanted to know, with all the recordings that you put in your book, have you actually heard all of them?
All but a few, I could say maybe on one hand that I haven't heard, and they are songs that were never released. I know titles, I know that they worked on them together, but the songs were never released, and I've never been able to secure a recording of them. But that probably down to no more than a dozen at most. All the rest I either through have obtained through private sources,
Hmm.
such as some of the songs on the CD from my first book, Beatles Undercover, or have just tracked down over the years through foreign sources, most of which I now have on CD because they have been, reissued on CD. But initially, a lot of them, of course, were on vinyl, sometimes obscure singles, EPs, albums from anywhere from Portugal to East Germany or wherever. So
Right.
yeah, I my collection is pretty comprehensive. I would say it's 99.98% complete as far as the titles that are in my book.
Yeah. And it's just so interesting to learn of the Beatles works for artists that, like I said, they had no prior contact with. Some of the songs that they wrote for other people are very good. Some of the slide guitar work that George Harrison has done
It's
for other artists
phenomenal.
is, yeah, some of his best work
Yeah,
is for other
absolutely.
artists.
Yeah.
It's really ironic there. But and I also like to slip in occasionally some of these cover not cover versions, side projects in my syndicated Beatles show, Every Little Thing. So that's one of the many features that you'll find in there. But I also want everyone who's watching to know that in the case of the 5 songs that we're going to talk about, 4 of them you can find on YouTube. So I'm going to put the links to those in the description box. Okay. The first song I want to bring up, which I only learned about through your books, I think a lot of people may know about this, but very fans will be surprised to learn about it, is that the very first, well, professional tour that the Beatles did was actually in Scotland in
Correct.
May of 1960, backing up a singer named Johnny Gentle. This is before they played in Hamburg. And Johnny Gentle actually wrote a song that John Lennon helped him finish.
Correct.
Tell us more about that.
Well, it was a song called I've Just Fallen for Someone, and Johnny was playing it backstage to the Beatles, and John had a song that he either was a portion of a song or a song that he had written, and he played that song to Johnny, and they took a portion of that song, or Johnny did, took a portion of that song and included it in I've Just Fallen for Someone. And about a year and a half, 2 years later, he recorded the song and released it as a single on the EMI label. But it was actually first released by Adam Faith
Hmm.
who Paul McCartney worked with back in the day. And Adam was the first to release it on an album. I don't believe he ever released it as a single. He may have, but he certainly released it on an album, also on Parlophone, just prior to Johnny Gentle. So that's noted in the
Right.
Adam Faith chapter in my book. But it's also noted in the Darren Young chapter because of the story of the Beatles backing him on the tour, and because it was initially written by Johnny. His name, when he released the single, he changed his stage name to Darren Young. So the song went out under the name Darren Young. His real name, his birth name, is John Askew.
Yeah.
And then he changed it to Johnny Gentle, and then he changed it to Darren Young. So the song was released shortly as a single, shortly after Adam Faith's version, as Darren Young. But I included it because it really was John's contribution to Johnny Gentle. John didn't really directly contribute the song to Adam Faith, or that portion of it to
Right.
Adam Faith. And I have to believe that Johnny Gentle, or Darren Young at that point, probably cut a reference demo for Adam Faith to use to record it, because obviously he was the writer. So Adam Faith would have had to have gotten the song from somewhere. And being that they were both signed to the same label, had the same producer, recorded in the same studio with the same conductor and the same arranger, etc., it's almost certain that Johnny Gentle had at least recorded, or Darren Young, a reference demo of the song for Adam Faith to use. So in either case, I decided to include both versions. One, the Darren Young one, which is rightfully, I believe, the precursor, even though it was released later, to the Adam Faith version, and to also mention in the Adam Faith chapter in my book where we talk about him working with Paul McCartney. I mention it there as well. So it's
Right.
kind of a double entry for that song.
Now, what John Lennon contributed was the middle eight of the
Yeah,
song, or
and
what we
the
call,
lyrics and the melody of the
right.
middle eight, correct?
And he never got a songwriting credit for it. Is that because it was before they had a publishing deal, the Beatles, or he never asked for one, or
More likely, even by early 1962, when this song was being recorded by Adam Faith and Darren Young, nobody knew who John Lennon was.
hmm,
So it was either forgotten, or it's no big deal. I'm not going to give him credit for the middle eight. Or maybe, in fact, at that point in time, they were a little bit concerned about raising alarm bells if they used his name, having to, get publishing rights, or having to pay him, or
right,
royalties, or whatever. You know, I never asked, and I did interview Johnny Gentle, or John Askew, about that. He just said, well, John just gave me that bit and I wove it into the song. I never really gave it much thought. So that was his answer as to why John's name was never included
huh. Now
in the
he
credits.
retired very young, right?
Yeah, he did. And he ended up, if memory serves me, I said, well, what have you been doing since your show business days? He said, well, I became a finished carpenter.
If it pays the bills.
Kind of like Harrison Ford before he became an actor.
Hmm, right.
So yeah, so I think he just went back to what he enjoyed doing, and I think he probably figured, his heyday in the pop teen idol type singer, that he was back then, going under various names and never really making it, on the hit parade in England, let alone in the United States. I think he just decided to throw in the towel and go back to a steadier income and a job that he equally enjoyed. So
Hmm.
I believe he's still alive.
He, as far as I know, he is.
Yes.
Yeah,
So
he's
a
got to
very, very,
be.
very enjoyable guy to talk to. Who's very, very open and helpful, and sent me some bits and some information and some news clippings and things from his career.
Hmm. Would you happen to know if he ever took part in Beatle conventions? Because
I
he
don't
played
know
a,
if it wouldn't surprise me that he might have in the Liverpool area
yeah,
or in England somewhere. I'm not aware that he ever did here in the States, but he's got to be up in his 80s now
yeah,
anyway.
yeah. I
And
did check a while ago, not recently, but I think he's probably early to mid 80s at this
Yeah,
point.
that would
He's
make
still with
sense.
us.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Definitely worth checking out. I wonder if he probably, as the Beatles became famous, while he was still performing, he must have performed the song and shown a little bit of pride in it because of John Lennon's contribution.
Yeah, and he did, and that's how I came to discover it. It was fairly well known in circles
Mm,
that John had a hand in writing that song because Johnny would tell the story. So,
mm,
or Darren or John Askew or however we want to refer to him. But yeah, he's told the story many times. So I tracked him down and just wanted to get it from the horse's mouth and get a little bit more insight into it. And he was more than willing to cooperate. So,
mm. Okay. All right. There's another song here I wanted to discuss. And like I said, you can go right to YouTube and listen to this. And I was very pleased to hear this song from an artist named Timon, Timon, who later became Timon Dog.
dog.
And the song is called Something New Every Day. Uh, Tell us a story about that.
This is one of those many situations of where when the Beatles first formed Apple, initially it started as a publishing company and they were out seeking songwriters and would put adverts in the trades for songwriters. That's how they got Gallagher and Lyle, and it's Mary Hopkin and a whole bunch of people that came along. Jackie Lomax, and they all these people were initially signed to Apple Publishing, and this is when they were still over on Baker Street in the old Apple Boutique building before
Hmm.
they moved to Savile Row. And Timon was one of these people who, took up the offer and raced over to the Apple building on Baker Street, and with tapes in hand, and ended up meeting Peter Asher and did
Hmm.
some demos. And Paul came in and played piano on one of the demos, which got released years later. He ended up not signing a publishing deal with Apple because McCartney, basically, according to Timon, McCartney wanted him to basically be kind of a pop song, tunesmith type of,
Hmm.
writer. And Timon was much more interested in developing himself as a songwriter for his own projects, his own recordings, and really wasn't interested in writing, 3-minute pop ditties.
Right.
And so he never signed the contract. They did offer him one, but he never signed the contract. So, and McCartney had heard one of his songs in the radio and really liked it. And so that's how McCartney decided to show up at the one of the demo sessions that Timon was doing with Peter Asher. And in fact, it's the same backing during the same period that the James Taylor sessions were done for James's Apple album. So
Wow.
the same basic backing musicians that are on Timon's recording that Paul plays on also includes James Taylor, Bishop O'Brien, Peter Asher. So it was basically during the same sessions.
Really fascinating. When you think about anybody turning down Apple and the Beatles, I mean the biggest band in the world, and makes me think about Mary Hopkin a lot because she was kind of molded to be in the very beginning more like someone that did show tunes and Broadway songs and standards, and she wanted to be a folk singer.
Yeah,
That's
Welsh.
what
She
her
wanted to
background
sing
was.
traditional Welsh folk songs.
Right.
Yeah, yeah, and there were other examples of that where people just felt that they were being steered in a direction they really didn't want to go in. And Apple did lose a lot of talent as a result of that, I think. But they had to look at the bottom line, and they were looking for hits. And McCartney certainly produced some hits for Mary Hopkin, and I don't think that her Welsh folk songs would have fared nearly as well in the charts as Those Were the Days or Goodbye or
Hmm.
some of the other tracks that Donovan wrote for her. Or so, yeah, there
Well,
were.
she had the perfect voice for that, very much like a Judy Collins type of singer. Um, and her follow-up album to Postcard, Earth Song, Ocean Song was fantastic if you love folk music.
Yeah,
He was just so perfect for that.
yeah,
So
She had other good songwriters help her with Gallagher and Lyle and Donovan, and she had a good producer with Mickey Most, and
Hmm.
so there were other people involved that were credible. But I think that, and I only recently learned that she had a clause in her contract that I believe 2 songs per album, 2 songs for every album she did for Apple had to include Welsh folk songs. And if you look at them, you will see that, in fact, that contractual obligation was fulfilled, which is one of the reasons why she did a couple of those songs in the Welsh language as well as in the English language.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah, very, very interesting. And just shows how important folk music was to her to make sure that it was represented on her music. So,
yeah, yeah. So she
so
stood her ground.
this guy Timon, he actually went on to do a lot of work with Joe Strummer.
That is correct. From the Clash
Yep.
until
So,
Joe died, and then
yeah,
that kind of was the end of that. And he's still around, and he still does. He's got a website, I believe, and I get newsletters from him occasionally, and he does tours and public appearances, but he's a virtual unknown outside of the UK.
hmm.
But I believe, is still fairly active in the business.
All right. Well, this song, Something New Every Day, is very 60s pop. It really is. And as you said, Paul does play piano on it, and James Taylor is on guitar. Definitely worth checking out. Um, and actually, he was born in Liverpool, Timon.
Yep.
Another one I wanted to talk about was Larry Hosford, California guy who played guitar, and George helped out on a couple tracks on one of his albums.
Yeah, that was a result of the whole early on Dark Horse project. Harrison was uh, doing his Extra Texture album, and he just started the Dark Horse label. And one of the artists or groups on the Dark Horse label was Attitudes,
Right.
and they were produced, I believe, by Dino Orelli, and Dave Foster was in that band, of course, very famous producer, and Jim Kellner was a
Sure.
member, was the drummer in that band. And so these were people that George knew and hung with at A&M Studios in Los Angeles when he was initially, when Dark Horse was a subsidiary of A&M Records. It later went on to be a subsidiary of Warner Brothers, as we know. But that was how he got. Leon Russell was also hanging around because Dino Orelli had worked for Shelter Records, and
Mhm.
Leon Russell was contracted to Shelter Records, or helped form it, actually, I believe. Denny Cordell was another one that was involved in Shelter Records. So George knew all these people, and somehow Larry got invited along, or Dino was producing his album, I believe, at the time, and that's how George got to meet him. And they hit it off and chit chatted, and George, you know, said, "Well, I'd like to play on your album," or Larry or Dino or somebody asked George to play if he'd like to play on the album. And George says, "Yeah," but as George has typically said a lot of times prior to and since then, he just wanted to show up and be a session player, just be a guy in the band. He didn't want to be George Harrison, the Beatle,
Mhm.
playing on somebody else's album. He just wanted to come in and hang and play and see if he could add something, more often than not anonymously, to the album, and that's how the whole thing came about.
Right.
It was
Wow.
just right place, right time, knowing the right people, and George liked his stuff and played on a couple of songs, 2 songs, I believe, on the album.
It's nice slide guitar work on the song Direct Me.
Yeah,
And there's also another song where he and Larry and Leon Russell do backing vocals as well, called Wishing I Could.
yeah,
So those are both on YouTube. And I like the slide guitar work a lot on Direct Me.
yeah,
So
yeah, it's
adds a
good.
lot to the song.
Yeah. And Larry, I believe, just passed away recently in the last
Mm,
couple of years. Real nice guy again, super cooperative. He'd written me a very long, in pencil, 2 or 3 page handwritten letter about the session, how it came together, how it developed. obviously I couldn't include it all, and there were actually some references to some less than legal substances that were involved at the time that I didn't care to include. That's kind of an unwritten rule of mine. But that was an interesting side story that remains in my collection as in a handwritten letter from Larry. But we won't go there. But
Hmm.
nonetheless, interesting story and a very worthy contribution.
Hmm. No hopes of an expanded edition of your book with a few extra tidbits of information in there.
Wouldn't do it. I wouldn't. I just that's a rule of mine. As anyone who's read my books knows, I rarely get into people's personal lives, only if it
Right.
absolutely is critical to the story, the musical story. So I don't get into people's personal lives. I don't get into drugs. I don't get into sex, just rock and roll.
Okay. And I admire you for taking that stance there, because I'm sure publishers just want the juicy stuff, you know.
Sure, they
So,
do. And I think it's one of the reasons why I've been lucky enough to have over all these years the cooperation I've had with the musicians and artists.
hmm. All right. Johnny Devlin and the Devils. Never
Yeah,
even
this is
knew
a
about
fun one.
this.
Well, as many times as the Beatles were on the road back in the day, they almost always either were a supporting act or had supporting acts. Of course, when they became more famous, they had supporting acts. And when they did their tour of Australia in 1964, um, I would assume it was Brian Epstein or the promoters, local promoters, who arranged for opening acts. And in this case, Johnny Devlin, who was originally from New Zealand but emigrated to Australia because bigger market. And he actually had a surf band. He was into surf music. He was more of a Beach Boys fan than he was a
Hmm.
Beatles fan at the time. But he was a surf band, kind of Australia's version of the Beach Boys, and was fairly popular in Australia. So he got on the bill when the Beatles were as a supporting act when the Beatles toured Australia in '64, and they liked him, they hit it off, and he'd get invited to the after show parties backstage and whatever, and hung with them, and played one of his songs for Paul called "Won't You Be My Baby." I believe that's the title. Yeah.
Yep.
And Paul, being Paul, said, well, let me throw something in there. How about this? As Paul is wont to do, and would start to rewrite the song.
Hmm.
And Johnny liked what he did, and kept it and recorded the song. And again, one of those situations of where I think, from what Johnny told me, and he was reluctant initially to speak with me about it, but he finally did.
Hmm.
I twisted his arm and coaxed him into talking to me about the whole thing. But I think he felt, one, that he didn't want to tack Paul's name on there, you know, thinking that people would accuse him of trying to ride on the coattails of McCartney.
Hmm.
So I don't know whether Paul just told him, you don't have to use my name, or Paul said nothing, or whether Paul ever turned his portion of that over to his publishing company. I don't know. Johnny seemed to think that Paul probably did alert his publishing company that he had a hand in the writing, but to my knowledge, no issuance of that record, and it's only ever been issued, to my knowledge, on vinyl as a single and on a sort of a compilation album. McCartney's name does not show up in the songwriting credits anywhere that I've seen,
Mm-hmm.
but almost certainly, I have no reason to disbelieve Johnny. And a means, motive, and opportunity were all there. And if you listen to the song, it certainly does ring to have some McCartney type hooks in it. So I believe his story. He's told it many times. It's never been disputed by Paul, or at least not to my knowledge, publicly.
Hmm.
So there it is. But no, again, no credit. And I think Johnny probably figured, I don't want to, you know, build the try and promote my song, based around Paul McCartney being, a co-writer, kind of like the old Bernard Webb, A. Smith thing with
Exactly.
Woman, or,
Yeah.
well, you put your name on it, Paul, anybody's going to buy it just because your name's on it. So I think maybe there was a little bit of pride involved there on Johnny's part that he didn't really want to have to give credit to Paul for if the song did become a hit. You know,
Yeah.
people would say, "Well, it's only because Paul McCartney helped you write it that it was a hit," kind of thing. So
You
who
put
knows?
yourself, in that place, and it's kind of awkward for some of these artists because
Yeah,
they feel like, the only reason why people are buying is because of a Beatle being on it.
yeah.
So, or having anything to do with it.
Well,
But it
Ruby
would,
Horse was worried about that. You
hmm,
know, on the one hand, they were overjoyed that George Harrison wanted to play, loved their song and wanted to play his signature slide guitar on it. But on the other hand, they were going, well, geez, what if the only reason people are buying this or the only reason it's a hit is because of George? And we want to be acknowledged and recognized for our talents and abilities as well. So there is that fine line oftentimes as to, it's a blessing and a curse, or theoretically could be
hmm,
a blessing and a curse, because on the one hand, it's a blessing, you got a Beatle on it, and it could potentially make it a hit or at least increase sales. But the curse is, you know, the only reason that it's a hit is because you have a Beatle on it. So then the artist loses their acknowledgement and their contribution. So
it's a tough position to be in.
yeah,
It really
yeah.
is. Still would be nice to know exactly what changes Paul made on that song. So,
Well, being McCartney, he probably did a fair bit of rearranging and maybe changed chord structure and, put in some more melody in the middle eight. Or I don't know if you have gotten to the Chris Mullen chapter in my latest
oh
book,
yeah, we
but
talked
that's
about that. We
a
talked about that.
great story. Yeah, where he talks about how Paul said, well, John and I would, when it came to the middle eight, we would take the song on a journey.
Yeah,
We would take it on like a vacation or an adventure and then bring it back.
yeah.
So, their idea for a middle eight was to go in a completely different direction and then circle back.
See, that's another thing about your book that you'd only find out about in your work here is not just all these side projects where the Beatle is listed and credited, but even when they're not credited,
Yeah.
because there are those times. And I just wrote to you, and I mentioned this in my other two podcasts. This new song that came out from a band called Exploring Birdsong,
Oh,
called
yeah, I've got it
Ever,
right here.
yeah, Ever the Optimist. And yeah,
Great
Paul
song.
helped out with that song, and I don't really hear a McCartney melody in there,
I don't
but
either, but it's a great song.
yeah, and Paul didn't want a songwriting credit, and it went out that way.
Yeah.
So who knows how many other songs are out there
And
that
there are almost
yeah.
certainly. And, every time he goes to LIPA and helps in these songwriting sessions with these aspiring students and artist songwriters, I'm sure there are plenty of times where, he'll either say, I don't want to be credited, or I'd rather, you not
Mm,
say anything, or he would tell the artist, yeah, go ahead and mention my name. You're welcome to use it. And maybe the artist says, well, maybe again, back to what we were just talking about, maybe I don't want my song overshadowed by, the name of a Beatle
right.
being included. So sort of a secret between you and I kind of thing, our little secret. So I'm sure there are more than a few other examples of that.
Right. And the Chris Mullen song, by the way, is called Myself Fooling Me,
Me.
which is a terrific song. It
Yeah,
really
yeah,
is.
yeah.
It is very but the melody is kind of Beatley. I can certainly hear Paul's influence on it.
Hmm.
And yeah, it's another terrific song to explore.
But not only did we learn about how Paul and Chris worked together
Yeah.
from my interview with Chris, but we learned how John and Paul worked together,
Hmm.
which I found, very revealing because I've
Right.
never really heard McCartney describe or explain his songwriting process with John Lennon in quite that manner, where we would take it on a journey
Right.
and then bring it back. So I thought that was just tremendous insight that he gave me there. I went, whoa,
Uh,
that,
yeah.
that's a, you know, that's a real moment.
I think that what was said in the book, Paul used the expression we would go to an island.
Yeah,
I think he
yeah,
called it an island,
yeah,
this
yeah,
middle eight.
yeah. Take it on a journey, or take it to an island and then come back,
Right.
take it to a completely different place, completely new idea. Like, just break, don't just kind of like try to come up with a middle eight to fit the first part of the song and the last
Right.
part of the song, but take it in a completely different direction and then bring it back.
Hmm.
Which,
No, that was great. That insight that we got from your book on that with Paul and with KRIS.
with KRIS, and he was
Um,
wonderful to interview. He was just great. He bent over backwards to be helpful.
all right. This is the only one that I have not heard. It's from Delaney Bramlett, of the five that we're talking about here. Delaney Bramlett, We Can't Be Seen Together. And this was a song that apparently Delaney co-wrote with George Harrison.
Correct. As most of our listeners probably know, George Harrison toured with Delaney and Bonnie in the fall of 1969, along with Eric Clapton and Dave Mason and Billy Preston, and basically the Mad Dogs and Englishmen, the Delaney and Bonnie and Friends band, which
Hmm.
became the Mad Dogs or the Englishmen in Joe Cocker's band, and worked with Leon Russell and all these people. So it was really a superstar band. Eric Clapton, and George was with them for dates in England, and then he went on to join them on their tour of Europe, Scandinavia, mostly, I believe, Germany and Scandinavia. They had a bus, doing as musicians do on a bus. They're jamming, they're rehearsing, they're throwing ideas at each other. And George asked, according, this is Delaney's recollection, and I interviewed Bonnie as well. She gave a slightly different version, but essentially the same version. George went to, at the time, Oh Happy Day was a hit.
Mm-hmm.
And George had gone to Delaney and said, Delaney, he said, show me how to write a gospel song, because Delaney was from the South. Delaney and Bonnie were essentially an R&B gospel blues band.
Right.
And so George went to Delaney and said, show me how to write a gospel song. I've never really written a gospel song. So Delaney says that he used Oh Happy Day as an example of a gospel song, and that's what George used to write My Sweet Lord. Now that is George's official story, and that's the story that was used in the plagiarism suit in court that George maintained.
Right.
But Bonnie says no. Delaney actually did use "He's So Fine" or the chord changes for "He's So Fine" from the Chiffons hit.
Yeah.
Uh, as an example, slowed down to George as an example of a gospel song. So Bonnie goes with kind of the prosecution's contention, and Delaney goes with the defense's contention. In either case, when My Sweet Lord came out, Delaney was a little miffed that George didn't co-credit him for the
Right.
songwriting, because Delaney felt that he really helped George write the foundation for My Sweet Lord, and he was a little ticked off about that.
Mm.
However, in hindsight, Delaney was happy that George didn't give him credit, because he would have been involved in the plagiarism lawsuit. And in fact, he was asked to come to court and be a witness, because he did have this story about Oh Happy Day.
Right.
But his attorneys advised him not to get involved, because he could end up being sued or held liable for damages as well. So Delaney never showed up for the subpoena. But Delaney had written a song with George called "We Can't Be Seen Together," and at the time he thought, well, screw you, George, you're not going to give me credit for helping you write My Sweet Lord. I'm not going to give you credit for helping me write "We Can't Be Seen Together."
Mm.
So that was the story, and that was what Delaney told me. And I'm still not sure the song ever saw official commercial release. It most certainly was pressed on Columbia Records white label promos with the same song on both sides, and I had copies of it for years till I burned it to CD and got a hefty price for it.
Hmm.
But I don't believe it. I've never seen at that time the Columbia labels were red and black, the commercial issues. I've never seen a red and black label commercial issue of that song. It's never appeared on an album. So the only place that I'm aware of that it ever saw any kind of physical release was on a 7-inch promo single on Columbia Records. But according
Interesting.
to Delaney, George did help him write that song.
And you're saying that Delaney could have been sued in court over this, even though he wasn't given a songwriting credit?
Well, had he have showed up and said, had George have put his name on the label, or had he have shown up, and testified, he probably would have been asked, what was the genesis of this song?
Yeah,
What was the evolution? And he would have said, well, I was trying to show George how to write, a gospel song, and I used
right,
"Oh Happy Day" as an example, which would have bolstered George's contention. But by the same token, George was found liable,
right.
and so I suppose they could have said, "Well, Delaney, you're liable too," because
Hmm,
you're the one that you admitted under oath that you showed him how to write the song. So,
right. So since I haven't heard the song, but you have, how
well,
would you describe
I'll
it?
send you a copy.
Okay. Well, can you
Not a
describe the
problem.
song for our viewers?
We can be seen together, da 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 da, and then I forget the middle eight, but it's a fairly catchy tune. Yeah.
Does it have a George Harrison feel to it? Can you recognize George's
Yes
influence?
and no. I mean, the middle eight sort of does. Maybe his contribution was more lyrical than musical,
Hmm.
but there's George doesn't play on it, so there's no signature slide guitar on it. But I presume it was written during that tour, and how much George actually contributed to it. And if George were alive today, maybe he would say, Delaney's full of BS, and maybe he would say, I only gave him a brief melody line, or I gave him a couple of lyrics. Or then again, George might have said, well, I basically wrote that whole song and Delaney took all the credit. Who
Hmm.
knows?
But it did come out as a promo single, and this was
It
in
did.
1973.
Yep.
Hmm.
Came out as a promo single.
I'm
And
surprised there isn't that the song is not on YouTube anyway, because these days everything has a way of finding itself
yeah,
on YouTube. So,
yeah, yeah. Or that people from Delaney's estate, or his widow, or even other collectors like you and I that have. I mean, I know I've sent that recording to more than a dozen people over the years, so
hmm.
certainly there are plenty of people out there that have it and have heard it, and I've
Okay.
seen it show up on bootlegs. So, but
Well, send
presumably because of my notations on it,
yeah, send it my way,
I will.
and I'll put it in my radio show, every little thing.
Yeah, it's a good song. I mean, it's not My Sweet Lord, but
Hmm.
good song.
I think everything that all four Beatles have done is important. It's part of the whole creative process,
Yeah,
whether it's strictly as a musician. Certainly, I tend to put a lot more weight in the songwriting side if a song is co-written by one of them, and there's a lot they've done producing for other artists too.
yeah.
So,
Although the production is always more difficult because even if they're credited, it's hard to really pick up in a producing style. The definition of a producer varies widely. I mean,
hmm,
the role of a producer could be anything from standing back and saying, I like that, maybe a little more here on the mix or there on the mix, or maybe you want to change something slightly different here or there, to someone who is totally hands on and is going to take a song and completely rearrange it and completely restructure it. So it's hard to know when you see that production credit, like George Harrison producing Ravi Shankar's stuff. I mean,
hmm,
how much of an influence did he really have on a lot of those songs for Ravi that he produced, other than the ones that clearly have a Western musical influence to them, or George's guitar or backing vocals. But it's hard to pick up, how
yeah,
much of an influence they had in a production role.
that's a good point. Although you can certainly cite, George's work with Badfinger,
Oh
and it
yeah,
definitely has a George sound,
or Paul.
and The first album from Splinter. It's got, well, George plays all over the album too, but it's got George's
Yeah,
fingerprints all
yeah,
over it. So you know it's a Harrison production when
yeah.
you hear
Well,
that. So,
Bob Purvis from
yeah.
Splinter basically told me. He said we were kind of embarrassed because it was basically a George Harrison solo album with us
Mm,
singing, the songs. Again, gets back to what we were just talking about it's a blessing and a curse.
yeah. Mm. All right. I just want to bring up one particular song here that I've heard about, and no doubt many Beatle fans have heard about, but we've never heard. And I'm guessing you never heard it either, because apparently only a few seconds have leaked out. But as many of us know, Paul worked with Phil Collins on the Press to Play album in 1986 on one track, Angry, where Phil Collins played drums. But it wasn't the only member of Genesis that Paul
That's
worked
correct.
with. Paul actually wrote a song with Peter Gabriel,
Yep.
and it was called Politics of Love. And I'm wondering if you know anything more about it, because it's never seen the light of day. Have you ever heard any part
I've
of it?
I've only heard that little clip that appeared in one of Paul McCartney's music videos. It was or one of his was it the Moving On one, or I'd have to check the book,
Hmm.
where you can see Peter and Paul would have been at the mill, I believe it might have been Abbey Road, where they're working on the song, and there's like 3 or 4 seconds of it that you can see and hear. I believe that it was a project that Paul was going to be involved with Peter for a concert in Japan that I think Paul was going to appear in and perform with Peter the song, and the whole thing fell through because of Paul's difficulty in being able to get into Japan at the time because of his
Hmm.
difficulties in 1980 when he went there with Wings. So, and the rumor I had was that they weren't happy with the way the the voices meshed together. Didn't seem to be a good harmonic vocal mesh between the two. That was the only thing I ever heard as to why it either never got finished or never got released. So hopefully someday we'll get a little bit more info and get to hear that. Maybe in the archive series it'll show up if
Yeah.
he ever gets back to that.
Well, I have a feeling, well, that could fit in the Press to Play box set.
Yeah,
I would hope. Um, yeah. And I've often said that a song like Pretty Little Head definitely has a Peter Gabriel vibe to it.
yeah, it does. It does. Now that you
So
mention that,
yeah. And
it
working with
does.
Hugh Padgham, who worked with Peter and with
Yeah,
Phil and
yeah,
Genesis, and
yeah,
it fits
yeah.
really well what Paul was listening to at the time, and works really well together, I think. I loved
And
his
those
work
are
on Press to
sessions
Play.
from that album that also have some pretty interesting and incredible outtakes. So I'm anxious to see the archive edition of Press to Play, very much so.
Well, let's hope it's not too long from now.
I
You know,
know, it's
we'll
just like,
take
come on.
anything.
Yeah. I think every time they keep doing these Beatle anniversary sets, it kind of, between the Get Back project and then Revolver, and it's probably for marketing reasons has set back some of these archive releases. So,
I gotta wonder a lot about that. What goes on behind the scenes and planning all these archival box sets, and there's so much
coordinating.
solo music that hasn't come
Hmm.
out in box sets. And do you want to time it with the anniversaries? And what if there's a Beatles box set at the same year? And
Yep.
you don't want it all to conflict. Do you want them all spaced apart? And who knows?
Yeah, and we haven't heard much from George's estate or John's estate of late as far as any sort of releases. So we
Well,
certainly know there's plenty of George Harrison material yet to be released, and we have yet to see live in New York City, which
and sometime in New York City,
sometime in New York City
which
as
was
well.
supposed to
Yeah,
come out this past year.
fall. Yeah.
And yeah. And just before COVID hit, there's an article in Rolling Stone. It was kind of like, I looked at it as a press release of sorts, where Olivia Harrison and Danny Harrison are talking about their plans for for George's solo albums to come out and tie it in with anniversaries. And we would get the concert for Bangladesh next, and then Living in the Material World, Dark Horse, the 74 tour, something for that.
Mm-hmm.
But there was no mention of Extra Texture, but it got through 74, and nothing has happened since All Things Must Pass. So I don't know. Did Revolver block that? Or yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
And then, what's stopping Paul from releasing So Many People Want London
Yeah.
Town and Back to the
London
Egg? And
Town, Back to the Egg. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
London Town, also some great outtakes.
Well, I'm thinking London Town was around the time that he recorded the Rupert the Bear stuff, the full album of that. So
Yeah. You got
maybe that'll be
Waterfall
part
or
of it.
Water Spout, which was a great song. And
Oh yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And Back to the Egg has got loads of stuff that you can put
Yeah.
on there.
Yeah.
So we'll have to wait and see.
Well, I'm sure
Anyway,
it'll arrive eventually, but none of us are getting any younger.
this
I
is
don't know
true.
if your listeners or viewers have. This is another release since my book came out. The Alan Darby Ringo plays on this as well. So there
So
it is.
it's one track that he's on.
One track, yeah. He plays drums on one track. Deep in the Heart of Me,
Okay.
featuring Ringo Starr, written by Billy Laurie, by the way,
Oh,
co-written by Billy Laurie, who was Lulu's brother, who Ringo knew and worked with, and of course Lulu's worked with Paul, so connection there.
didn't Billy Laurie do some work for the Ringo label?
No, but Ringo was on his Ship's Imagination
Okay.
album.
All right.
David Henschel did something. He did that the Ringo album with the synthesizer.
All instrumental. Yep.
Yeah, yeah.
That was an interesting idea.
Well,
Almost like a Thrillington.
very much so. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So tell folks how they can get a copy of the new book, Fully
Well, the
Uncovered.
best way is to email me directly. And it's a very easy email for Beatle fans to remember. It is 6270 at charter.net. 6270, the years that the Beatles were together recording for EMI, also the title of their Red and Blue Greatest Hits albums. So just the numbers 6270 at charter.net. Folks can also find me on Facebook. The book is available on Amazon. Just type in the title or my name. We could also use some more reviews on Amazon. They've all been 5-star across the board, so I'm very proud of that. But we can always use more. And eBay. I'm selling the book on eBay. And for any of the people outside of the United States who are interested in a copy of my book, I found that probably the least expensive way to get it to you over there, and as a result of slightly discounted it on eBay, is to order it from eBay through their global shipping program, and that will get you the book and probably with the least amount of postage as is absolutely necessary to get it to you. So those are the best ways to get it. But if you want a signed copy, definitely email me at 6270 at charter.net. And if you forgot that, you can find me on Facebook and I'll give you all the information there.
All right. Chris, thanks so much for doing this. It's always a joy having you on.
Always
And
a joy being on.
we want to have you back. We'll explore some more side projects.
Anytime.
We haven't even scratched the surface. There's just so
No.
much that's out there.
Yeah, there's only about another 300 chapters left.
We have to do a show for each chapter, I think.
There you go. I'm game.
That'll keep us busy. All right. Thanks so much for being here, Chris. And thanks to all of you for watching. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you very, very much, Ken. Cheers.